Hello and welcome to another gaming video on my gaming section of my YouTube channel. And today I'm not really reviewing anything or offering any guides, but I want to talk about the Nintendo DSi. As you know, I'm a big fan of the DS range. My DS Lite has been my trusty games console for quite some time. Before that I did own an original DS. And recently I've just purchased a Nintendo 3DS, and there's another console sandwiched in between there, and it's the DSi. And there's a good reason why I never really upgraded my DS Lite to the DSi. I didn't see that it offered much of an improvement. Okay, there's some hardware enhancements in the DSi. I mean, it's got cameras, a slightly faster processor, a bit more RAM, it's got internal storage, and I think it's got an SD card slot, all of which you don't get on the DS Lite, but it comes with a downside, is that it decreases the battery. And despite the fact that Nintendo promised lots of new software for the DSi, there really was just a handful of DSi enhanced titles, most of which would play on an original DS or DS Lite. So it's a bit of an odd console sandwiched in between the DS Lite, which was absolutely fantastic, and then you've got the 3DS, which is a whole new console, a whole new platform of gaming, which obviously offered backward compatibility. So why would anybody upgrade from a DS Lite or even an original DS? When the DSi came out, if you hadn't originally owned a DS and you were looking to get into that sort of market, then yes, the DSi would have been a great purchase. I mean, I'm not knocking the console, it's a fantastic console. And maybe the additions of cameras, and it was the first console to introduce online, like a DSi shop, so that's something new it brought. But it just seems oddly sandwiched between the fantastic DS Lite and the very, very powerful and superb Nintendo 3DS. Like I said, I've owned a DS, a DS Lite, and now a 3DS. The only reason I upgraded from an original DS to a DS Lite is because of the poor build quality of the original DS. The hinges were quite brittle, and they look like Game Boy Advance SP hinges. And when they brought out the DS Lite, they fixed a lot of issues there. The screens were brighter on DS Lite over the original DS, and the battery life was superb. I mean, I've got my DS Lite, which I've had 6-7 years. Battery is still going, hinges are still great. It's a little battered, but it works fantastically. I've never bought a DSi. I mean, I'd like to add it to my collection at some point, but I don't see any offer. If you've got DS Lite, especially sort of nowadays, the next obvious jump would be a 3DS, because it can play DS, DSi and 3DS games. The one reason I keep hold of my DS Lite is because it has the Game Boy Advance port. That is another downside of the DSi, it lost that. But really, the DSi, it's a great console. It looks fantastic, it's got a lovely aesthetic to it. And like I say, the cameras were a bit of a novelty at the time. They're not the greatest of cameras, but then neither are the 3DS's cameras. They're not meant for high quality shooting, they're just sort of for snapshots and in-game use. I would like to pick one up, purely because it has internal memory and it can be jailbroken, it can have custom firmware installed, something you can't do on a DS Lite, and purely just to add it to my collection. Great console, more for those who weren't already in the DS line than sort of a viable upgrade. I don't think the bonuses of the DSi outweighed the disadvantages that you would lose from the DS Lite. But there you go, it's just one of those consoles. It's great, I've never owned one, and for good reasons. I've held on to my DS Lite for quite some time, and then made the jump to the 3DS. I mean, it's quite late now, I'm sort of 10 years after the 3DS was launched, I've just purchased one. But it still makes perfect sense to go from the DS Lite to the 3DS. Other than the Game Boy Advance slot, the 3DS can do everything that my DS Lite can do, and really I have no need for a DSi. There's nothing it can do that I can't do on the 3DS. So that's it, there we go. Great console. Did introduce some sort of new features that they then took over onto the 3DS. So you've got the cameras, internal storage and DS shop. But if you're looking at it these days, skip the DSi, go straight to a 3DS. You have the additional functionality of 3DS games. That's my thoughts on the Nintendo DSi. It's a fantastic console, it's just a bit of a weird one, and depending on where you are in the in the handheld market as to whether it's worth you purchasing one. Like, link, watch my videos, enjoy.